everyone to this 30-something session of the Architecture and Society series. I think it's the 34th. And it's very nice to see that there is a very big crowd. I mean, considering our normal turnout. It's much better than before. We have been trying to popularize the event through the good offices of Epistle Communications. And they are, I think, doing a great job because I think people are getting the message. Sorry? Today's talk is by Aarti Dhingra, who is a young architect. It's kind of needless to say young because looking at her you can tell. So she's an architect who has taken the bold decision to find an alternative path to a career very early in her career. And I think it's very interesting. I'm especially pleased because you see this whole series, Architecture and Society, was started in order to make the architectural profession a little more responsible, if I may use the term, or at least more aware of the fact that they are here to serve society. And whatever they do has to have some immediate benefit to society. It's a very difficult kind of message to give to professional people nowadays who are very highly specialized and who are experts and tend to forget that normal people actually really require their help. And so anyway, we've done 30 odd talks on this theme. But Aarti's case, I think, is very special because when she started, Griha, which is the organization which is doing these talks, Aarti worked with Griha and in fact promoted the cause for quite a while, many months. And after that, she then took on this, made this decision to do her practice, to further her career in a different manner, slightly different manner from what is normally being done. And so it's particularly interesting for me personally to hear what she has to say and to sort of get some whiff of the kind of world that she is now inhabiting, which I think is it's a wonderful message for young architects everywhere. But let's see. We see before we go too far. So Aarti, will you begin? You'll stand and talk? Okay, great.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, sir, for inviting me to be part of the Architecture and Society series. And I would also like to thank all my friends and professors and everybody present here for attending it. So when sir asked me to come and talk here about what I'm doing in Kumaon, I was totally clueless about what I could talk about. For the longest time, I couldn't really come up with a topic. So then I decided, as the title of this talk suggests, Notes from an Alternative Journey, to take you through a journey of my experiences from living and working in rural Kumaon. Some of you have seen my posts on Instagram and have been wondering where I've been and what I've been up to. Most of the comments and messages that I get say, wow, I'm so jealous of you. The place looks like heaven. And but so Instagram only shows the rosy side of the picture, but there are so many stories that comprise the rosy pictures. So I'm going to share some of those challenges and instances that make up those stories. So this place where I live is a small village called Satoli. It is about 35 kilometers from Almora, which is the nearest town. This is Almora. It is 70 kilometers from Haldwani, which is the nearest city. And it is about 15 kilometers from Mukteshwar, which is the nearest tourist destination. So many villages are adjacent to each other and flow into each other, making it a bunch of interconnected, scattered houses scattered on a hilly terrain. The area has 3 main NGOs. Chirag, which is the oldest one, which primarily works on livelihoods and education. Then there is Arohi, which has established a hospital there in the area. and it offers healthcare facilities to remote villages by conducting medical camps there. They also work on livelihoods and education. Then there is Alap, which is the newest one, and sorry, this is a photo of the school at Arohi. Then there is Alap, which is the newest one, and their primary focus is the forest of the Himalayas. So most of the population is rural, and because of these three NGOs, there is some amount of urban population there as well, which has settled in the place. So that explains the broad context of the place. Now, mostly these days, a lot of urban people are trending to purchase land in the hills to buy their dream mountain home. Land is affordable there, and probably everyone knows by now that Delhi is going to choke sooner rather than later, and who doesn't want to have a foot in the hills, right? So this is a bit like a video from the place. So, but while this is happening, that the urban people are moving in, many rural communities are moving out as well, or rather are being forced to move out because of various reasons. And because of this influx of urban people into the area, the place is now a cluster of villages which is undergoing rapid construction activities. And the reason I got there was also because I was posted at the building construction site of one such project. So I was posted at the site architect for a building construction site. I was working with the architecture office that was designing the project, and my main job was to be on site every day to coordinate between the project architects who were in a different city, the clients who were in another city, and the various contractors on site who were executing the project in order to develop design details and support the construction process. So my experience at site was quite unique in the sense that I learned carpentry, I worked with natural materials, understood various tools and the tectonic details of building, which architecture school doesn't really offer. It was also a very challenging position to be in because the design was very detailed and it was not easily understood by the workers. They had never built a building like that before and never seen detailed drawings before, and it was my responsibility to ensure that the design details are being followed accurately to the T. I had to convey site issues back to the architects and the architecture issues back to the contractors. Of course, all of this was happening at an altitude of 7,000 feet, so the weather was harsh, especially since the job involved working outdoors every day. It wasn't easy to begin with, but I slowly got used to it. So these are a couple of pictures from the site. Yes. This is what my office looked like. There was no toilet. There were challenging days spent trying to curb delays, persuading various teams to cooperate with the designs, working with the architects and clients in different cities who wanted project planning, but the site teams were not that great in planning. So the outlook of most of the site teams was, they had a very relaxed attitude. So to give you an example, if I were to tell my electrician कि इसकी earthing तो कर दो कम से कम building की, his response would be that, madam कुछ नहीं है, छोटा मोटा झटका लगेगा, ज़्यादा कुछ नहीं होगा, you know. So to working with those people at site and having a boss and a client who were really detail oriented was quite challenging. So logic doesn't work in the mountains. That was one learning. And trying hard to not let any unforeseen events happen, especially with little prior experience in this domain. Ensuring the right things in the right location at the right time, cooperating with sudden, unforeseen, and panic-creating events, and working with the limitations of the topography and the climate. I think I can boil down the challenges into 3 main points. The first one is, not kidding. I think Murphy must have forgotten to add an asterisk while he was writing this fact, that this is always true in the case of a building construction site. Whatever could possibly remotely go wrong does always somehow manage to go wrong, always. So I'll give you an example. So I'll give you an example. We were supposed to construct a sewage treatment tank, and it was a simple underground tank. And I had issued the details to the contractor, and I had gone to Delhi for a couple of days. And when I returned, there were two tanks instead of one. And for the longest time, I could not figure out. Why are there two tanks instead of one. And I asked the contractor. So, him being a formidable patriarchal creature, he scoffed at me and said, "Go see the drawing for yourself." So I did, and the drawing just had one tank. So I couldn't decode it. What just happened? And then it struck me. This is the drawing. It shows a longitudinal section and a transverse section. The only possible thing that could have happened was that he read both these two separate sections as two separate tanks. So, well, now we had two tanks instead of one. I'm saying this casually right now, but back then when it was happening, I was pulling my hair off. This brings me to my second point, communication, drawings, and empathy. As I was the main point of communication in the project, it was crucial for me to communicate with immense clarity so that absolutely no loopholes can be later misread into. The other interesting experience was being on the receiving end of drawings. So mostly as architects, we're always on the other side of the drawing board, making those drawings, but when you read them in order to build something, it is important to be able to know what all material you need and how exactly to build it. And that drawing in the previous example, there was nothing wrong with this drawing in any way. It was drawn by a structural engineer with absolutely correct information, but the way it got misinterpreted gives us something to think about. So also I put empathy along with communication because I feel that in such a role, to understand communication, you need to have the ability to put yourself in different people's shoes. You need to know why the architect might have made those decisions and also why the contractor will sulk when asked to execute them and what the client's response might be. The latest point, the challenge, and you all saw this coming, is gender and age. There were of course logistical issues such as the lack of a toilet at site. The nearest toilet was a basic Indian WC, which was about a 10-minute uphill climb away. And since I was the only female at the site amongst 40 male workers, I was the only one impacted. Then there were of course other deep-rooted issues such as not accepting authority. The contractor was a 65-year-old man, and there was absolutely no chance he was going to take a 25-year-old female issuing instructions at site. It was a very patriarchal setup and tough to get through. Every time I instructed him to make changes, he would not agree to me and rather call the client to confirm whether those changes need to be actually made or not. This made my job very challenging. The basic power and authority I required to carry forward with my tasks was being undermined in so many ways. I try to sometimes find funny workarounds to it, like if there would be a situation where the contractor is insisting and unwilling to change because of his pride, but architecturally we feel that the other option is better. In order to prove a point, I would actually ask all the masons what they felt. And the masons, being craftspeople, are mostly more sensitive to aesthetic and material details. And they would always, although very hesitatingly, take my side and majority would win. Of course, there were harder times when but the only way to work around it was through courage and a fair amount of hard work to prove my technical capabilities. I think if the project had a formal structure where one could sign off decisions, it would have helped. So to put everything on record is important at the site. Sorry. So another learning were, So while all of this was going on at work, I was also living there as a local, and this made me understand the larger context of all the construction activities. It formed a major part of the learning experience. Again, the rosy picture started off with a lot of difficulty. Electric surges because of thunderstrikes would keep destroying all my expensive chargers one after the other, so I couldn't be dependent on my gadgets. Even it was tough to get past human insecurities and judgments of some of the locals to find decent accommodation and get some acceptance, only to be later accepted by insects and pests as well and get terrible attacks of fleas and bed bugs. The nearest vegetable market was in Almora, and some nights I used to go hungry because of that. Despite all these challenges, it wasn't really possible to live in a silo, isolated. One can do that in the city, but here I was slowly becoming part of the local community. Like it or not, you couldn't avoid it. I was gradually experiencing the changing seasons, got invited to Kumaoni festivals and celebrations, began to develop relationships with local people, made friends, lived in homestays, and began to understand how they live and how this ecosystem works. Most of their challenges and stories made up the direct context for all these construction activities taking place and the architecture as well. To give you an idea of that, let me bring the Kumaoni household life to center stage. A typical day in the Kumaoni household involves the woman tending to the cows in the morning. Then she cooks a meal for the entire family. Then she goes to the farm to work, also fetches water, fetches oak leaves for the cows, pine wood for burning in the angitis and chulas, and comes back and cooks again. If they don't collect wood and pine cones in the spring, then they won't be able to burn wood in the winter because they need to burn dried wood in the winter. So it's almost like squirrels, like they're automatically so rooted in nature, and you have to think about tomorrow, what's going to happen next year. So they are nature. The men sometimes work as masons, laborers, or run shops or work at local NGOs. If not, then they sometimes help the women with the household work. Some of them do not do much work and only get drunk in the evening and beat their wives. Most of the work is done by women, including most of the physical labor. Pahari women are really strong. If they work as paid labor, then they do all of their household activities plus their daily labor work. But they get paid lesser than men as daily laborers. The only exception to their work is when they are menstruating, because then they are not allowed to enter the kitchen. So these are just pictures from a Kumaoni household. If we look at the architectural unit of the household, then we see that it is a very simple, self-sustaining unit. The organic waste from the kitchen goes to the cattle. From the cow dung, it goes into the earth, and from there, it goes back again as food into the kitchen. While all of this is going on, the waste segregation is just a small part of it, something we don't manage to do in the cities. Over here, because you're living so close to nature, the immediate reality is very visible. Every bit of waste you generate makes you think what will happen of it. The place doesn't blur your vision by offering imagined realities like the city does. The main source of water are natural springs found scattered in the topography. They have enough water sufficient for judicious usage, but in the summer, sometimes they also dry up, so rainwater is becoming more and more important. There are many consequences in relation to this issue of water scarcity, and one of the main reasons is, again, a rosy Instagram picture. It is this one. This is a monocultured pine forest, which means that this forest has only cheer pine species. So pine is not a native species to Kumaon. It was planted during the British rule. Indigenous species like kafal, oak, rhododendron, etc. fix the soil and maintain the moisture contents and nutrients in the soil, keeping it fertile. Whereas pine is an invasive species. It dominates, does not let the indigenous species grow. It also degrades the soil, depletes the groundwater, and is a major role player in the forest fires. So pine is an invasive species. And it dominates, does not let the indigenous native species grow. It also degrades the soil, depletes the groundwater, and is a major role player in the forest fires. Despite all these disadvantages, pine is the most proliferating species because it grows faster than species like oak and deodar because of the winged nature of its seeds. It is used primarily for its commercial value as timber in the construction industry, and the resin of the pine, what we call lisa in Hindi, is one of the important industrial ingredients for making turpentine oil, paint, etc. So it has a lot of commercial value, but at the same time, it's harming the environment. As a result of degraded soil and water scarcity, the rural population is facing problems in farming. The fertility of the soil is impacted. Also in pine forests, the temperatures are higher than the temperatures of deodar and oak forests, so it causes warming as well. This understanding clearly helped me learn that there is a deep connection between the rural community, their forests, their water, their occupations, and also their architecture and migration. And this entire ecosystem is very fragile. Once I understood this brought various questions to my mind. What is the impact of the rural people leaving this place? And the simultaneous urban influx? Where is the material, the wood, the stone, for all these construction activities coming from? What are the economic impacts? What are the spatial and social impacts? And most importantly, what can we do? Also, construction is a very water-intensive process. Where is all that water coming from? So let's try to look at all these questions one by one. Let's begin with water. Most of the urban people's building sites are at the top of the ridge. That's because that's where you get the Himalayan view from. And the water obviously flows down into the valley. So if someone taps into the spring at the top of the mountain and uses it extensively, the 20 village homes down the valley will not get any water. Legally, if the Nola is on their land, Nola is the spring. Legally, if the Nola is on their land, they are free to use it. But water is a shared and very scarce resource in this area, so how valid is the legal point of view? Rainwater harvesting actually during and perhaps before beginning the construction processes might be a good idea. So I went through another disconnect myself in the summer months. I lived in a place which was entirely dependent on rainwater. So during the peak summer months when the water from the last year has depleted and it hasn't started to rain for this year yet, there was this buffer time when there is absolutely no water. And during those months, I had to come back home from work, take a bucket of water, go downhill and fill that bucket in the Nola and bring it up for my personal use. And I literally had to fetch a pail of water. So, and this was supposed to be for all my needs, washing, bathing, cooking, everything. And now this reality of how I was living created a very strong contrast of the fact that some of the building sites where I was working were designing swimming pools. And I couldn't connect with what I'm working on in the day and some kind of utopian imagination being converted into reality and how I'm actually living in the evening, which is like the real harsh reality. Well, thankfully, I was able to convince a few clients against the idea. The situation is so severe that so many mountain homes cannot afford to even have Western WCs because of their flushing systems, which use so much water. It gets as bad as not being able to flush for days in order to save water. So showers, bathtubs are really something one needs to think about. And it is all connected to these pine forests. Moving on to the natural materials, as we've discussed, pine is the most widely used timber. And then there are other hardwoods such as sal, shisham, tun, deodar, etc. Wood and stone are natural resources for the villagers, but the situation is such that stone quarrying is not legal and neither is chopping wood. So using salvaged stone from old houses is one option. The villagers, nevertheless, get to use wood and stone in a small quantity from the common forests only for their personal use. In Hindi, they call it hak ka hai, which means it is rightfully theirs. But when the outsiders step into the scene, it gets distorted. The prices of all these materials shoot up. So the economic impact is so much that the locals cannot afford to have stone or wood anymore. Also, sometimes the middlemen or the gatekeepers use these rightful resources to sell them to the outsiders. And as an outcome of this, something unexpected and weird happens. The outside homes are built of stone and wood and have slate roofs, but the local homes are built of concrete and brick, whereas you'd expect the opposite. And this is RCC without any structural or earthquake guidelines. So what they really know how to build, what was really theirs, and they had been building for generations, is actually gradually shifting away from them. And this is also depriving them of something very basic, which is beauty. This shift is also related to a lack of ownership now in their natural resources. If the community forests are burning down if the community forests are burning down in forest fires, it is no more their forest. A lot of people have stopped caring. And forest fires are real. Everyone knows about them, but nobody really wants to talk about them. They're destroying the forest and a lot of important biological activity in the topsoil of the earth. This brings me to highlight the work of an important NGO which is working in the area, that's ALAP. And unfortunately, Sheba could not make it here today. But so an interesting thing which ALAP is doing is that instead of working on forestry through detours, they're actually working on forestry by growing forests. And they've figured out a method which is a Japanese scientific method developed by Dr. Akira Miyawaki. It's called the Miyawaki technique. In the Miyawaki technique, they figure out what are the actual native species of the area, and they plant sample saplings of a particular age, which form an interconnected root network underground. And it actually becomes like a community of trees which supports each other, gives each other the required nutrients, and grows much faster and much taller and much denser, like an actual native forest. So the rural people are moving out because farming is not working out for them. Most of the soil is degraded, water scarcity is real, and there's havoc created by monkeys and wild boars, which again is a result of an unbalanced ecosystem. Foxes and other species that feed on those monkeys have become rare. Anyway, most people move out to find better employment in the city, and this makes me wonder, how are our cities accommodating these people's interests? The rural people have so much value, indigenous wisdom, which comes from living in harmony with nature. And now they are displaced into a society which lacks nature. What is happening to that wealth of knowledge and wisdom? Is it just getting dissolved and lost? As they leave the place, they're also leaving the old structures that they inhabited. These structures have a lot of architectural wisdom. I had the opportunity of living in an old home for about a year. This is a restored Kumaoni hut. It was originally a cow shed, called goat in Hindi. It was adopted and restored by Shiba Sen, the founder and CEO of ALAP, the organization that works on the forests of the Himalayas. And living here made me understand how sound and wise old architecture is. And do we really need to discard it in order to accommodate our modern interests and needs? Perhaps not. Perhaps we can live in harmony with the old while still bringing in the new in order to strengthen and uplift the old wherever needed and still make space for our modern thoughts. I am in the process of documenting this the transformation of this place, which is making me learn that perhaps we should look at buildings themselves as a process and not as a final product. The architecture itself is constantly evolving. What we create is a living structure, and if it is in sync with nature, it becomes one with it, grows with it, and evolves. This forced rural to urban migration is also sharing the same space with voluntary urban to rural migration. And what are these urban people bringing with themselves to the area? They're not usually farming, and they don't tend to cattle. So definitely the circularity in the connection that we previously saw in the Kumaoni household is evolving and changing. But what is it changing to? Or is the intention just to exploit? Are these people actually genuinely adding any value to the people and the place of this region? Or is the intention just to exploit the resources and make easy profit? As urban people, we unfortunately are mostly not living in harmony with nature. Perhaps that would be the first step to really acknowledge and be sensitive to the ecosystem in order to add value to it. Another interesting impact of this two-way migration is gentrification. There is a steep difference between how the community was, say 5 years ago, and how it is now. One example is Airbnbs. With this gentrification, Airbnbs have taken so much space in the area that there is hardly any space for the local renting community. And this is what exactly happened in New York and San Francisco as well. For the longest time, I wasn't able to find a place to rent because everyone just told me they prefer to give it on Airbnb. Just about a couple of years ago, you could rent a room with a warm, welcoming Pahari family for like 1,000 rupees a month. But now it has shot up to about 25,000 per month, and they still prefer short-term Airbnb guests. This situation also resulted in an interesting kind of barter system for me. I worked on some architectural projects in exchange for food and accommodation. The clients would get architectural work, something which they wouldn't otherwise pay for, and I would get accommodation and food. This was probably the only way I could have sustained in the area. Moving on to the spatial impacts of this influx, let's begin with understanding the spatial qualities of the 100-year-old Kumaoni structures. As you can see, they're connected together, one house joined to another, in a row of about 40 houses. This is a typical Kumaoni row house called a bakli. It accommodates the cattle in a lower floor and separates the cattle path for them. The heat from the cattle rises up to go into the houses. Back then, probably humans had not dominated nature as much, so they were still afraid of nature and hence stuck together in a community in case they need each other. A couple of years later, slowly the houses begin to scatter out, but still the verandas and the courtyards were fairly common and public. This in current Kumaoni villages. But now, as the city people move in, we're bringing in a dangerous virus. It's boundary walls. So a lot of main village paths in the area go through people's private property and through their courtyards. It is not surprising to find that to get to one house, you might have to go through a couple of houses on the way. The moment we bring in fencing and 6 feet tall boundary walls, this gets affected. And I can give you an example of a foreigner couple who had come in the village. They had taken up a place on rent and they had started growing marijuana. And they started cultivating it and selling it. And the place that they had taken up was falling on the village path, and then they barricaded it because they did not want villagers to trespass. And a little while later, somebody lodged a complaint with the police that these people are cultivating marijuana, and it was trouble for them. But when those people were later asked, what was your problem? They said that they blocked the village path. They really had no trouble with the marijuana. Pahadis are pretty chill people. So another such things that outsiders are bringing in is CCTV cameras. So the village themselves work as a social space. To give you another example, if you go to a village and you look for something like, say, ghat ki dal, which is a local dal which is grown in the village, you ask one village, ghat ki dal hai, they would, if they don't have it, they'll call out to the other person and say, ghat ki dal hai, ghat ki dal hai, ghat ki dal hai. The entire village would know that the person is looking for ghat ki dal, and then somewhere it would come down to you. And this exactly works as like a CCTV camera. And I mean, the CCTV camera is the neighboring uncle or the neighboring auntie. You don't really need the CCTV camera there. And these spatial changes which we outsiders are bringing have social impacts. So a year after moving there, I had quit my job at that particular project and had begun on the next phase of my journey, which was working on different smaller scale projects in the area. Some of my work now involves working for the rural people to design their homestays, and some of the projects were for the urban community that is settling in, where I want to explore natural materials and more friendly materials like earth and bamboo. And throughout this journey, the personal transformation has been the primary experience. I think the architectural story is just a result of the human story. And when I came to this place, I was a fearful and restrained city girl. I remember when I was working in Ganju sir's office, I used to tell him sometimes that I don't want to pursue architecture. I don't want to construct anything. I don't think I'm cut out for architecture. I should go and pursue something else in design. And I was almost there too. I had applied for a master's at NID and had even managed to get through the very cumbersome selection processes, all because in hindsight now I can see that I was afraid of building. And that's probably because of the disconnect we have from nature because of our lifestyles in the city. And at that point, Sir had said something very interesting which had a very deep impact on me. He had said, Aarti, if I leave you in the jungle for one night, you're going to manage to build something. And I think this really changed how I looked at architecture. The moment I could connect building to nature, I was not afraid of it. And only now, when I sat down to write the contents of this talk, I began questioning why did I come to this place, to Kumaon, and the dots just connected. I understood that my two main motivations for being here were first, to be with nature, to know myself better, and second, to learn how to build. So there are a lot of things that happen with the personal transformation which cannot really be described, but I'll try to mention a couple of those things. So when we were designing these mud cottages at the Himalayan writing retreat, the craftsman way of working was so intuitive that he used to feel the mud and he used to say that whether this can go a single story or a double story. And in the city, we're used to working with calculations and structural engineers and giving absolutely correct answers to everything. So I was not used to this process, but getting in touch with nature and getting in touch with this way of architecture where you need to accept that intuitive side of you is, I think, really important. It is a very human, feeling-based process which is somehow died in city life today. We need to connect to that other side. Another thing was a perspective on new materials. In the city, we really consider mud as dirt. And, but in the mountains, it is a form of cleansing and renewal. So after every meal, they do this lipai on their chulas, and during all their festivals, they do lipai to make it new every time. And this was a very different perspective for me. And the other thing is that we, with our modern architectural training, we try to make architecture really immortal. Like we will use copper roofs to make it really, make the quality as good as we can. But this is good architecture in terms of what it is taught to us as good architecture, but it makes me question that, is it really relevant architecture? I mean, is good architecture still relevant architecture? You could be a very good firm sitting in a very metropolitan city, designing a building which has perfectly sorted out circulation and all the services are tucked away and all the poetry is happening. But what about the relevance? What is it doing to the context? And yeah, I think rekindling my relationship with nature and building materials and forming deep relationships with the local people, especially the rural women, um, it brought about this transformation. That's about it. Thank you. 1.5 years.
I think that was a wonderful exposition, talk, Aarti. And I'm sure there are questions or observations or statements to be made. I'm not sure. Or, yeah, you're happy to take on questions? Okay.
Hi, I'm Nikhil. I just have one question. You spoke about the cycle of the cow and the gobar and going around. So, do you plan to own a cow?
No.
That's all.
He lives in Satoli as well.
Yeah, Aarti, it was wonderful to hear your thoughts.
Identify yourself, please.
Sorry, my name is Ankit Revo. I'm a professor of architecture in a school in Delhi. So I meet a lot of students who also have this fear of building and construction, and they feel that we want to do something with design, but not exactly building. So it's wonderful to hear your story, how you sort of overcame that fear. Would you mind coming to our school and talking to students about this?
Sure.
You know, we would like to rerun this in our school, if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Hi, Aarti. Wonderful to hear you. And in such a young age, if you're able to achieve this, it's really commendable. I'm a practicing architect. My name is Vikas, and I teach and we practice as well.
You taught me at SBA.
Yeah, I know. So wonderful. I mean, if you are able to do this at this age and in this time, and when we are really going blasé about this urbanization and killing all over the greens and whatnot, but wonderful. I mean, I really would give you a lot of accolades for this. But what I want to understand from you, how was your journey when you started to work with the community, and what were the challenges that you faced, because that could have gone very negative as well.
So I think I had fairly set the ground, because when I was there in the place, I didn't begin working with the community. I was working on a commercial project. So I used to work on the project in the daytime, and just my evenings would be spent interacting with the community. And because it's a very small community, it is very easy to get to know people in no time. The village, like I showed how it works like a CCTV camera, they would get to know who's in the village and what are they doing and what are they up to and how are they, and all their past history. So it was easy to connect with them, but it was difficult to get through architecture to them, because they would they wouldn't really understand what I do. Some people would confuse what I do with being a contractor or a site supervisor or a mason also, but not architecture, because they or an engineer. But like they would ask me, "Isme kitna sariya dalna hai?" and all of that. I couldn't answer those questions. So it took a fair bit of time to make them understand what is really architecture. So I think that's still happening. I haven't achieved that yet.
The other part, I would also say that, and I'll also tell you that, maybe you should do it, because things are changing in the hills so much. Maybe you should, put what is traditional and what is now evolving.
Yeah.
And how you want to approach it in future.
Right. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Aarti, I am architect Amar Puri,
Okay.
and I have some experience of working in Nainital and Mukteshwar.
Okay.
I
This
think,
place is very close to Mukteshwar.
yeah, I know, Anji. I think you were wrong when you said that it's on the lighter side, that these men don't work and they start drinking in the evening.
I said sometimes they work.
Sometimes they work. But the second part, that they start drinking in the evening, you were absolutely wrong. They start early morning.
Hi, I'm Virendra,
Hello.
architect. Yeah, hi, Aarti. There was a certain lightness about your presentation. I don't think age matters so much, but I think you're so into the subject that you are able to express your connect to nature very well through your speech. My congratulations on that.
Thank you very much.
But how is the urbanization that is rapidly taking over Satoli and the entire Himalayan range? How do you see the urbanization being reoriented by your activity? Do you see that your activity, which is based on a very ancient economical system, because you're working in a predominantly agricultural domain, and this domain is gradually disappearing, right? Because economies are taken over that are more to do with trading, more to do with exploitation, like you rightly said, and more with making everything man or human oriented, man oriented, and you're working therefore in a realm which is trying to somehow reclaim which is ancient. How do you see your activities progressing in dealing with people who are native? Because I know it, and you know also that in Sonapane, Ashish and his wife, both of them, Deepa, I think Deepa is her name, she's trying to engage many women in working with more urban ideas like making handicraft or making bags, tailoring certain other things, to allow them a emancipation from the traditional bondage, traditional economies. So we are moving from, by the process of emancipation, we are moving away from traditional systems which are sustaining a certain architecture, a certain culture, into something that is even export oriented, right? You're familiar with that, which has a plus point, of course. Women are getting more free from the bondage of their husbands or their family. Many widows, many divorcees are able to, and I think that's what modern urban economy is about. I'm not saying, I'm not glorifying that, don't misunderstand me, but I think there's a price for modernization, and you are really at the threshold because you have chosen a area, a location which is still very, as I said, very ancient, but at the threshold of modernization. So how do you see to integrate your wisdom and understanding of the rural culture in view of the urbanization? Do you think you are affecting it strongly? Do you think also that you can integrate this modernization of economies in your rural approach with the cows? And that's how I understand. It was a little joke, but I think the cow culture will cease sometime. It will become a strong, efficient cow culture. It is not an individual who holds a cow under his whatever, under his shed, but there will be 100 cows then. There would be somebody from Delhi moving in, he buys all the cows, and you have a very different economy happening. So from this little minuscule molecular economy to a larger urbanized understanding of economies, how do you handle that?
I think that's a very challenging question, and that's true. That I mean, a lot. I still feel that to support those modern economies, you still need a lot of ancient wisdom, because the modern people coming from the city would not be able to just execute that simply. Even Ashish and Deepa require rural women to, support what they're doing over there. So it is important to respect that ancient wisdom. Like I said, in terms of architecture, bring in the modern strengths and strengthen that what is there. But at the same time, I think it's important to rekindle that relationship with nature, because I think the answer lies in that. So, like, I mean, the rural people are losing their relationship with nature because they're losing ownership with their, say, cows because of farming, and farming because of forests. And bringing in forests is something we all can do, whether we're modern, whether we're ancient. I think we can just, like, really bring in forests. So, probably forests is the answer.
Virinder, that was a very good answer.
Okay, I am Sabyasachi. I teach sociology in Jamia Millia Islamia. I have a curiosity, and maybe that curiosity is a question for you. I've done a lot of work in forests, and so I really appreciate the fact that the touch of the mud is so perfect that they can tell you whether it's going to take you 2 stories or 3 stories. But at the same time, you say you want to take architecture to this society. My question is, why do you want to take architecture to this society? Maybe.
Yeah, probably the society knows better.
No. It's different. It's a different notion. The point is, architecture is one way in which you conceptualize what we call construction. Maybe there is something else there which is not architecture, but which is a different way of looking at materials and construction. And the clue that you give us is the touch of the mud is going to tell them how many floors it will go. And if you want to convert this into architecture, you're doing a lot of harm. You are actually taking them away from a very, very organic way of looking at things. So maybe you should resist from bringing architecture to the society. Maybe you should explore what else do they know like this. You know, for example, in the places that I have stayed, from seeing, they can gauge what kind of structures can be made. See, I was very fascinated for documenting how does a mason actually look at the construction process when the architects don't give them drawings. That kind of perception, that kind of intelligibility is not architecture. I think the vernacular is important because it does not have architecture as a notion. Okay. And maybe you should not take architecture to that society.
Well, my perspective was that me being an architect, what can I learn from their wisdom? Like, I don't want to take it away from them, but I want that, like, I want to connect with my intuitive side. And,
perfect. So I would suggest that you should be an apprentice to this man
to the mason.
And find out how does he get that sensibility,
Yes.
the touch of earth can tell him how high it will go.
Yes.
I think that is the training that you need to do.
Yes.
And for that you need to throw away architecture as a construct, otherwise you will not be able to do it.
I think, Sachi, your question presumes a definition of architecture which is currently available in the schools of architecture and which Aarti is also an heir to. I mean, that's the legacy she carries. And I found it, if I may, found it very interesting throughout your talk that the things that you were putting before us were actually questioning what is architecture. And I think probably your question has to do with that, rather than, you see, we presume that we understand and we have a certain definition of architecture, which we, offer to our students. And I think Aarti's experience to me was interesting because it questioned that.
I just want to give you one other instance from your talk. What you call CCTVs, maybe that whole mode of communication is the basis of conceptualizing a landscape. And so when you conceptualize a landscape, you are doing it through sound and not through terrain, right? And how does that feed into designing the kind of habitats that they make? Is possibly a way of looking at things how they make there.
Yes.
I mean, I'm saying this from my experiences in other places. They do something like this. I mean, they have to make construction so that this throw of voice is not hindered anywhere. For example, the path that you said was, it had to be that way, right? So the sense of, a lot of things will change if you keep those little observations in mind and try and see how actually habitations actually work.
Yes,
It's
that's
just a
what
loud
is
thought on it.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm I'm Henry Phantom. I teach, I run a practice. I work in Almora as well, so I've actually been to sites she's been working on. So during that exchange between Virendra and her, there was a slight, there's a slight misconception that urban people, as she was talking about, are only urban people from Delhi who are migrating there, or places like that, which is actually not the case in in many situations. There are a lot of people in Kumaon and in that area who are actually coming back, and that brings another whole other twist to what the whole notion of aspiration. And I actually work with a client who has this notion of emancipation, of teaching people what good architecture is. He's living in California and he's trying to bring good architecture to Almora. And so you're caught between, oh, there are not like two realities, you know, there's these multiple realities. And how do you make people value an architecture which is their own, okay, when they're actually valuing the architecture of people who are not the urban Delhi architecture is what they look at, whereas the people who are going from here are looking at that which was already there. How do you make people start valuing their own architecture is probably another very big question which starts sort of hanging in the middle of these two realities. And it becomes very problematic. And when I actually saw what Aarti was doing, I was fascinated because I've been practicing for, I wouldn't like to say it now, but 15 years, and I have not had the guts to do what she's doing. It takes tremendous guts to throw away everything you're accustomed to a practice, to this very systemized way of doing things, and actually question your own relevance, if I can put it like that. She's questioning the validity of being an architect. She's not questioning the validity of architecture, actually. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm just saying that out loud because I find it very, very strong, powerful, and gutsy to do. I haven't been able to do it, so I'm.
And can I say that you were the reason that I'm here? because, because when I graduated out of college, I got placed into this multinational company called Atkins, who have designed this Burj Al Arab. And then I went to Henry and said, what should I do? And then he told me that if you go there, you're just going to work there for some time and then you're just going to get married, have kids, never understand what architecture is.
Henry?
And then that made me come to Ganju sir and work in. Sorry. No, well, I'm just saying that you're the starting point of the journey.
Going to invite Henry to come there?
He's already been there.
No, I know, but you know, to take part in it.
Oh, definitely, yes. Yes.
I have a question. Lately, I've been coming across a lot of advertisement for volunteer tourism programs. So these programs, they charge you a fee, particular fee, and they have a particular set of people who go and build mud houses in a lot of villages. And having worked there for a lot of time, I think you must have come across such organizations.
Actually, I haven't, but the organization Arohi that I was talking about, I initially worked with Arohi, I volunteered with Arohi on one such building program, and they were giving loans to local people in order for them to build homestays, and then when they build their homestays and get the revenue, then they can repay the loan. So that sort of a system was happening, and we were sort of volunteering to design those homestays.
So a lot of organizations I've come across, they do not do it. They promote themselves as a self-sustaining business that's mostly promoting tourism in the area for economic generation. So how truthful are these organizations in their intent? I'm not talking about Arohi in this case because it's doing a lot of landscape work also. So that's pretty evident they're quite truthful in their intent. but most of the organizations you might have heard about. So, how beneficial are these?
I can't comment on how truthful those organizations are because I don't know those organizations. But probably, yeah, I mean, it actually depends on what they are making. Like if they're making something which is actually meaningful and being going to be used by the community and adds value to it, then probably that's truthful. But if not, then probably not. I don't know. Yeah.
Hi, this is Rahul Bajaj. I am also an architect. And continuing from where Nitin left, I guess, uh, y- we broader question, I guess, is to ask what we had left. I think what Mr. Virender also left where is that why people are. It's not only limited to Kumaon, but it will be to all hilly areas, or for that matter, all other rural areas in India. Is that why people choose to go that route? Is there something more fundamental which we can give to them, which was answered by some people with skill set trainings or other things? Was that why they choose to go that route? Is
That route
that
meaning move to the mountains?
move? No, no, no. Move to the that newer construction route, or choose that building methodology of using these so-called modern construction, say saria and concrete and brick.
It's faster, it's cheaper, it's more convenient.
So
I think Henry would like to say
then it is actually giving value to them. It is a value because this will
something. It's
this will
short-term value.
no. How do you say that? Because if the old construction would have been giving them enough value, they will, it's an automatic process in nature. Human being is an intelligent being, so why that human being is choosing that other route, and how we can, whether that those things have enough value, or we can make them understand. So we need to ask those questions.
Okay. Um,
Yeah.
how can I come in on that? So, way back in 2003, I was still in college, and I had the good fortune of working with Professor Agnihotri. Some of you will probably know who he is or know of what he did. And so we were looking at post-earthquake reconstruction in Uttarakashi and areas like that 10 years after um, the Uttarkashi earthquake of 1992, where there was tremendous devastation in the area. And we found two very interesting findings in 10 years, that after 10 years when we went back. One was that villages that were predominantly vernacular suffered very little damage. Um, the other was that in places where concrete and cement had come in, there was almost 100% mortality. This was pointing towards two things. That one is concrete is very dangerous if in the wrong hands. And the other thing it was pointing at was that there's a very strong cartel of cement and steel industries that pushes very strongly for these materials to be used and ensures that governments and policies and development agencies push their agenda of steel and concrete. It's not about it's more pakka or it's less pakka. It is that these are very monetizable products. They are huge industries, huge networks. It's like, why is there no higher tax for the second car in Delhi or in India? Car companies don't want it. It's not because it's bad for the environment. So there are huge people and interests that do not let these things happen and push for steel where you don't need steel, push for concrete where concrete should not be there. Uh, yeah, we have glass everywhere. Why do we have leads rated glass everywhere? It's a question. We don't answer those questions because they are very inconvenient questions to ask. Not big. It's got. No, and then they big. I mean, and then there are these fictitious aspirations built up behind them, that a pakka ghar is this. So it's not entirely so simple. You know, the answers are not entirely so simple. They're not entirely architectural either. The answers are sometimes very removed, far removed from your architectural intent.
Yeah, I think
So-
that's why I just wanted to raise that as an open-ended argument, because those are the questions we will need to ask to address those issues.
It's very interesting that these questions are being asked. And I hope that you'll go on asking them for a lot more time. Thank you, Aarti, for starting the process.